Catherine of Aragon. Catherine of Aragon was not supposed to be Henry VIII's wife at all. She was originally sent to England to marry his older brother Arthur, Prince of Wales, and the two were wed in 1501 when Catherine was just 16 years old. Arthur was 15. The marriage lasted 5 months before Arthur died, most likely from sweating sickness, leaving Catherine a teenage widow stranded in a foreign country with no income, no clear future, and a father-in-law, King Henry VII, who was too miserly to send her home properly or fund her household in England. She spent nearly 7 years in a state of limbo, sometimes barely able to feed her servants, insisting all the while that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated and that she remained a virgin. Whether that was true became one of the most consequential legal disputes in the history of Western Christianity. When the old king finally died in 1509, his 18-year-old son Henry inherited the throne and, within weeks, married Catherine. For a time, the marriage seemed to work. Henry was young, athletic, and genuinely fond of her. She was educated, politically sharp, and had even acted as regent when Henry went to war in France, overseeing the English victory at the Battle of Flodden in 1513. But Catherine's body could not deliver what Henry needed most. She endured at least 6 pregnancies over the course of their marriage, and nearly every one ended in tragedy. Stillbirths, infant deaths, a son who lived only 52 days. Only one child survived to adulthood, their daughter Mary, born in 1516. By the time Henry became fixated on Anne Boleyn in the mid-1520s, he had convinced himself, or perhaps simply decided, that his marriage to his brother's widow had been cursed from the beginning, forbidden by Scripture, and therefore never valid. He asked Pope Clement VII for an annulment. The Pope refused, partly because annulling the marriage would have been a humiliation to Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who at that moment had considerable influence over Rome. Henry responded by dismantling the Catholic Church's authority in England entirely, appointing himself supreme head of the Church of England, and granting himself his own annulment in 1533 through his newly appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer. Catherine refused to accept any of it. She refused to call herself Princess Dowager, the title Henry assigned her after stripping her of the queenship. She refused to stop signing her letters as Catherine the Queen. She refused to allow her daughter Mary to visit, because accepting the terms of their separation would have meant legitimizing it. For the last 3 years of her life, she was effectively imprisoned in a series of cold, damp manor houses. Buckden, then Kimbleton Castle in Huntingdonshire, isolated from the daughter she adored and stripped of most of her household. She died at Kimbleton on January 7, 1536, at around 50 years old. The official cause was almost certainly cancer, and the physicians who examined her body afterward reportedly found a blackened mass attached to her heart, which some modern doctors believe is consistent with cardiac sarcoma. Henry wore yellow when he heard the news, which contemporaries interpreted differently, some saying it was a sign of celebration, others that yellow was the Spanish color of mourning. Either way, he did not grieve publicly for long. Anne Boleyn was already pregnant. Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn changed England permanently, and England repaid her by cutting off her head. She had spent years at the French court as a young woman, and returned to England polished, confident, and entirely unwilling to become Henry's mistress, the way her sister Mary had been. Henry pursued her obsessively for years, and her refusal to give him what he wanted, without the title of queen, may well have been the calculation that reshaped a nation. To marry her, Henry broke from Rome, dissolved the monasteries, executed ministers, and remade the religious identity of the country. Their daughter, born in September 1533 and named Elizabeth, would one day become the most celebrated monarch in English history. But Henry needed a son, and Anne could not produce one. She miscarried in 1534, and then again in January 1536, just days after Catherine of Aragon died, and this second loss reportedly devastated Henry. Contemporary accounts, including the hostile but detailed letters of the imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis, described the fetus as male and apparently malformed, though Chapuis was no friend to Anne, and his accounts should be read with that in mind. What happened next was swift and brutal even by the standards of a court that had already seen extraordinary violence. Within 4 months of the miscarriage, Anne was arrested on charges of adultery with 5 men, including her own brother George Boleyn, as well as conspiracy to murder the king. The charges were almost certainly fabricated. The timelines presented at trial were impossible in several instances, with accused men placed in locations they could not have been. The trials were rushed, and the outcome was never in doubt. She was convicted on May 15, 1536, and executed 4 days later, on May 19, on Tower Green, inside the Tower of London. She was somewhere between 28 and 35 years old, her exact birth year being disputed. As a reported mercy, Henry arranged for a French swordsman, rather than an English axeman, to carry out the execution, since the sword was considered faster and cleaner. Witnesses described her as composed on the scaffold, delivering a short speech that carefully avoided condemning the king. She was buried in an unmarked grave beneath the stone floor of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, just inside the tower walls. Henry announced his engagement to Jane Seymour the following day. Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour got what none of the others managed. She gave Henry a living son, and it killed her. Jane was the daughter of a Wiltshire knight, quiet and fair-haired, considered modest and biddable, in ways that made her attractive to Henry after the fiery and combative Anne Boleyn. Henry had begun paying her attention while Anne was still alive and still queen, sending her gifts and letters during the very weeks of Anne's arrest and trial. 11 days after Anne's execution, on May 30th, 1536, Henry married Jane at Whitehall Palace. The speed of the remarriage was noted even at the time. Jane's great task was to produce a male heir, and in the autumn of 1537 she was pregnant. The labor, which took place at Hampton Court Palace, was long and punishing by any account, lasting reportedly close to 3 days. On October 12, 1537, she gave birth to a healthy boy, the future King, Edward VI. The court erupted in celebration. Bonfires were lit across London. Henry finally had his legitimate male heir after nearly 30 years on the throne and 4 marriages. Jane never recovered. Within days, she developed what physicians now believe was puerperal fever, a bacterial infection of the uterus that was responsible for an enormous proportion of maternal deaths in this era, and for which there was no effective treatment. She died on October 24, 1537, just 12 days after giving birth, at Hampton Court. She was around 28 years old. Henry was reportedly devastated. He wore black mourning clothes for several months, which was far longer than convention required. He did not remarry for 2.5 years, an extraordinary gap given how quickly he had moved after his previous marriages ended. And when Henry himself died in January 1547, he left instructions to be buried beside Jane at St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle, which is where both of them remain today. Whatever his marriages meant politically, Jane appears to have been the one he genuinely mourned. Anne of Cleves. Anne of Cleves is the one who got away, and she was clever enough to make sure of it. The marriage was arranged entirely for political reasons in 1539, engineered by Henry's chief minister Thomas Cromwell, to align England with the Protestant German states, at a moment when Henry felt dangerously isolated in Europe. Henry had never met Anne. He agreed to the match after seeing a portrait by the court painter Hans Holbein the Younger, which he found sufficiently pleasing. When Henry finally encountered her in person at Rochester in January 1540, having ridden ahead of the formal welcoming party in his impatience, the reaction was catastrophic. He found her deeply unappealing, complained to his horrified advisors that she was nothing like her portrait, and reportedly said he had been brought a Flanders mare. Despite his private revulsion, the marriage went ahead on January 6, 1540, because the political alliance still mattered, and canceling would have been humiliating. Henry later told physicians and advisors that he had been unable to consummate the marriage, citing his strong dislike of her as the cause. By summer, he wanted out. Cromwell, who had arranged the match, was arrested, convicted of treason, and executed in part because of Henry's fury over the situation. Anne, watching all of this, read the room with exceptional clarity. When Henry's representatives approached her about an annulment, she agreed immediately and cooperated fully throughout the process. In exchange, she received a generous settlement that included Hever Castle, Richmond Palace, an annual income of approximately £4,000, and the warm and safe title of the king's beloved sister. She remained in England, lived comfortably, attended court occasionally, and outlived everyone. Anne of Cleves died on July 16, 1557, at Chelsea Manor, more than 10 years after Henry himself had died, at approximately 41 years old. The cause was most likely cancer. She is buried at Westminster Abbey, the only one of Henry's wives with that distinction, and she is, without question, the one who handled the entire situation most intelligently. Catherine Howard. Catherine Howard was probably around 16 or 17 years old when she married a man who was 49, morbidly obese, increasingly paranoid, and had already executed one wife. The age gap alone tells you most of what you need to know about how this was going to end. Catherine was a cousin of Anne Boleyn, raised in the chaotic household of her step-grandmother Agnes Howard, where supervision was minimal, and older men with bad intentions had easy access to young girls. A music teacher named Henry Manox began grooming her when she was around 13 or 14, and a household secretary named Frances Dereham later pursued a more serious relationship with her. Both of these relationships were used against her later. Henry became infatuated with her at court, calling her his rose without a thorn, showering her with jewels and properties, and marrying her in July 1540. Whatever Catherine felt about the marriage, she had almost no power to refuse the king. She was queen for just over a year before Archbishop Thomas Cranmer delivered a letter to Henry in November 1541, informing him of her premarital relationships with Manox and Dereham, and further allegations that she had been conducting an affair during the marriage with a young courtier named Thomas Culpeper. Henry reportedly wept when he heard the charges, a reaction observers found striking in a man who had sent dozens of people to their deaths without visible emotion. Whether the affair with Culpeper actually occurred in the full sense remains debated by historians. What is not debated is the outcome. Dereham and Culpeper were executed in December 1541. Catherine was attainted by an Act of Parliament, meaning condemned without a formal trial, and beheaded on February 13, 1542, on Tower Green. Witnesses said she was so terrified she could barely walk to the scaffold unassisted, and could barely speak once she was there. She was likely 17 or 18 years old. She was buried alongside Anne Boleyn in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the two Howard cousins sharing the same cold floor beneath the same tower where both had briefly been queen. Catherine Parr. Catherine Parr survived Henry VIII, which was by the 1540s, no small achievement, and she did it through intelligence, careful management of her own image, and at least one extraordinary piece of quick thinking. She was 31 years old when Henry chose her in 1543. Already twice widowed, well-read, deeply interested in religious reform, and by most accounts, one of the most educated women at the English court. She had actually been in love with Thomas Seymour, the dashing younger brother of the late Jane Seymour, when the king's interest in her became known. She later wrote that she set her own will aside and followed what she understood to be the will of God, which was a graceful way of saying she had essentially no choice. As queen, she was a genuine intellectual presence, not merely a ceremonial one. She published her own religious writings, including a work called Prayers or Meditations in 1545, making her the first woman to publish a book under her own name in England. She also took an active role in the education of Henry's children, including the young Elizabeth and the even younger Edward, and by many accounts was a stabilizing and affectionate figure for all three of Henry's surviving children during her years as their stepmother. She came within a very narrow margin of being arrested in 1546. Conservative members of the court had persuaded Henry that her reformist religious views amounted to heresy, and a warrant was reportedly drawn up for her arrest. Catherine talked her way out of it in a private conversation with Henry, carefully reframing her theological discussions as simply her humble attempt to learn from his superior wisdom and to distract him during his painful illness. Henry accepted this entirely and reportedly turned on the men who had come to arrest her the following day. When Henry died on January 28, 1547, Catherine was free. She married Thomas Seymour within months, quietly and in secret, finally getting the man she had wanted before the king intervened. She became pregnant quickly, which at around 35 was already considered a significant risk in an era when childbirth was genuinely dangerous at any age. She gave birth to a daughter named Mary Seymour on August 30th, 1548, at Sudeley Castle in Gloucestershire. Within days, she developed puerperal fever, the same infection that had killed Jane Seymour 11 years earlier in the same damp English autumn. She died on September the 5th, 1548, just 6 days after giving birth. She was 36 years old. She had outlasted a king who had executed 2 of his wives, discarded 2 others, and worn out a 5th with childbirth. In the end, it was not Henry who killed her, but the same merciless biological risk that claimed women across every class and country in this era, quietly and without any of the drama that had surrounded every other loss in Henry's long and devastating marital history. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.